Hello, everyone. This is World Review with Ivo Daalder, a weekly look at news from around the world produced by the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. It's Friday, September 27. It's been a busy week in New York at the United Nations and around the world. We'll start this morning with Lebanon, where a war between Israel and Hezbollah seems to be only days away, with major bombardments by Israel and retaliation by Hezbollah of rocket fire, including against Tel Aviv over the weekend, and questions about whether a ground invasion is imminent. Then we'll take a look at Ukraine. President Zelensky was in the United States this week. He met with President Biden, Vice President Harris, and this morning with President Trump to try to sell Americans on his victory plan. More security assistance, allowing the Ukraine to hit deep inside Russia, and security guarantees as the basis for a long-term peace. And finally, overnight in Japan, a new leader of the LDP was elected, and he will become prime minister on Tuesday. What will this mean for the future relationship between Japan and the United States? We'll talk about all of these issues with the three reporters who cover these stories. Yasmeen Abutaleb is White House reporter of the Washington Post. Ken Moriyasu is Washington correspondent in Nikkei Asia. And Yaroslav Trofimov is chief foreign affairs correspondent at the Wall Street Journal. Good morning, good afternoon for Yaroslav, who's in Dubai. Wonderful to see all three of you. Let's get going. Yasmeen, you traveled in the wake of the president, both up to New York and then watching what was going on in Washington. Let's talk about the issue that seemed to be dominating his week, like so many other, Lebanon. Where are we in this conflict? How is the United States trying to find a way out of it? And what do we think the Israelis and Hezbollah are likely to do?
Well, even like you said, I think we're days away from a full-scale war between Israel and Hezbollah, if you don't call what's happening now already a full war. I mean, more than 600 people in Lebanon have died, tens of thousands displaced, many more injured. So, this has already been a pretty catastrophic week in Lebanon, strikes in Beirut and in the south of the country. What happened this week was the president traveled for the United Nations General Assembly to New York, where he wanted to give this address that sort of cemented his foreign policy legacy. This is probably one of his last very high profile forums to talk about what he's done as president. He reflected on the whole arc of his career, but obviously hanging over it all was the escalation in Lebanon and the extreme fear of what's to come between Israel and Hezbollah. I think there is a lot of concern that this would be much worse than a war between Israel and Hamas, which obviously has been raging for about a year now, because Hezbollah is a much more capable adversary than Hamas. Israel has degraded them quite a bit in the last couple of weeks with the walkie-talkie and pager attacks and the airstrikes in Lebanon. But there is still, a lot of fear that this could bring Iran directly into the war, what role the U.S. would play. And so what we saw unfold this week was the U.S., along with France and the UK and Qatar and Egypt and a number of allies, put out a call for Israel and Hezbollah to immediately agree to a 21-day ceasefire. And the idea was that they did not want this linked to Gaza, right? Hezbollah has secured its fate to Hamas's and said that they are going to continue firing rockets and they will not come to an agreement with Israel without a ceasefire in Gaza. The U.S. wants to de-link these efforts, at least for this initial 21-day ceasefire. And in that time, you would negotiate a longer-term agreement along Lebanon's blue line, getting Hezbollah to move back behind the Litani River and allow these about 70,000 Israeli residents. There are also about 100,000 residents in Lebanon who have been dislocated from the border with Israel, to allow all these people to go back to their homes. What happened is the U.S. thought that Netanyahu, they say they privately had gotten a positive signal from Netanyahu before they went public with this plan on Wednesday night, and that they expected Netanyahu to come out and say he was open to it, and that this was moving in the right direction. And I think, as we've seen happen many times over the last year, Netanyahu did the exact opposite. He immediately rejected the plan, said Israel would degrade Hezbollah, Israel was going to forge ahead. And then just this morning, before we all logged on here, Netanyahu gave his address at the United Nations where he repeated that he said Israel would move ahead and degrade Hezbollah and has basically thrown out the window this idea of a ceasefire.
It's Yaroslav. You're in the Middle East. This is a tense moment because the one thing that the Biden administration has tried to do, other than supporting Israel, is to make sure this war doesn't escalate. And yet, it seems that inevitably, one way or another, that's exactly what's happening. And the worry is not only that it will spread to, of course, to Lebanon, but further closer to where you are in Dubai, with it involving Iran in one form or another. So how do you see it from the vantage point of the region and from your reporting?
Well, I think the biggest surprise of all of this was the weakness of Hezbollah's response. We've all been told about, the enormous arsenal it had amassed, ballistic missiles, tens of thousands of projectiles. And yet, if you look at what happened in the past 2 weeks, after sustaining this almost existential blows to its leadership, the entire Radwan force leadership was eliminated. Thousands of its cadres were crippled in this pager and walkie-talkie attacks, and yet not a single Israeli has been killed in return. So and the question is it because Hezbollah is degraded to a great extent? Is it because it is holding its fire? And if it's holding its fire, why? And if you talk to people in the region, the most plausible explanation is that Hezbollah is Iran's insurance policy. Hezbollah's entire arsenal, its purpose was built by Iran to prevent an attack on Iran itself by Israel, to protect Iran's nuclear program. And so right now, Hezbollah sort of has this lose-lose situation. It can either continue absorbing these blows and getting weaker and weaker, or it can defy Iran, which is probably not likely to do, and then deprive Iran of this shield that it built painstakingly for 20 years.
Interesting. I think that the latter explanation, that this is Iran's sort of deterrent, is regional experts, and including in Israel, seem to agree that that's the case. The problem, of course, is the more you degrade that deterrent, the less deterrent there is. So Iran also is in a bind in the same way that Hezbollah is, in one form or another.
It's also in another way, because we've seen the penetration of Hezbollah and we've seen the penetration of Iran with the assassination of Hamas leader Ismail Haniyeh. So I think the Iranians are also wondering what is in their pagers and their walkie-talkies in their arms.
So I wonder, sorry.
Oh, yeah. I was just going to chime in with one sort of quick question, which is, it seems like another calculation of Hezbollah's, the really horrible economic state Lebanon is in, and that Lebanon itself just cannot sustain a war. And they are, I think, much more attuned to public opinion, given that they are a major political party in the country. I just wonder if you see that as a factor as well.
Yeah, I think that makes I think that makes a lot of sense. There's multiple factors for not wanting to go to war. I think that's right. But Ken, I wanted to bring you in here. Just it strikes me that what Israel has demonstrated in the past couple of months really is a technical and a intelligence superiority that is quite remarkable, in the way that Yaroslav and Yasmeen talked about. It does raise a question, and I think it's appropriate for a country like Japan, which thinks in much more geopolitical terms. How much can you rely on intelligence and on technology to solve what are essentially political problems? And how much do you actually need to think about how does this part of your strategy fit into a larger framework? How do you look at it, and what do you hear in your own region?
Well, I was talking to some Chinese diplomats last week, and they were very much interested in the pager incident. And they said that this is really a game changer, in that everyday goods were used as a weapon. And that all this talk of like electric vehicles, all the electric vehicles on American roads suddenly shutting down, it could become a reality. So like Israel has crossed the Rubicon, is the way that this Chinese diplomat was talking about. In the bigger geopolitical context, I want to share an anecdote. 18 years ago, I was in Jerusalem interviewing Prime Minister Ariel Sharon in his office, and he had just finished the Gaza disengagement. And he was telling us that I, Sharon, am prepared to make some painful compromises, but that compromise can never involve Israel's security, And that's the case now, and it will always be the case. So I think any discussion has to be within that context. And I think if you look at the past 75 years of Israel-Palestinian issues, the only time that there has been any progress is when Israel made unilateral movements. That would be the Gaza disengagement and the Abraham Accords of 2020. And both of those happened because they didn't involve Israel's security. So, and the other takeaway is that any negotiated settlement has never worked. And trying to find a middle ground, either through the roadmap, even the Oslo Accords, none of that has worked. So I think if you want to make a breakthrough here, I'm very skeptical that any ceasefire negotiations would work, and that America has to focus with Israel first, and then make sure that you remind the Israelis that there are no free lunches in the Middle East. I think the Abraham Accord was a free lunch because it ignored the Palestinians, and that came back in the shape of October 7th. But if you ask Sharon, the Gaza disengagement was not a free lunch because it made concessions. It was unilateral, but it put the ball in the Palestinian court. And I think that's the kind of settlement the only kind of settlement that will work.
I think you're putting this in the larger, bigger context, and sort of raises what I think is sort of this big this big issue, which is, how do you achieve security for Israel? Do you do it by eliminating your enemies militarily, or do you do it by negotiating a coexistence? And I think that in the end has been Israel's big question almost every single day, which is the question of whether you can trust your enemies enough to live in coexistence, or whether you have to rely on your unilateral capability to eliminate them. And that's been at the source since 1947 in one form or another. And I think we're living through that again. I'm struck, by the way, and Yasmeen and Yaroslav, I don't know whether you've looked into this, but it seems to me, even though there's a growing division in Israel over Gaza and how long to continue that war because of the hostages, there's much less division over the question of whether or not to continue with Hezbollah, because everybody understands how big a security challenge and threat Hezbollah is.
Well, yeah, there is also a different moral element to it, right? I mean, Palestinians have legitimate aspirations and to live in dignity and peace, and many Israelis agree with that, even though Netanyahu probably doesn't. Hezbollah has no legitimate reason to have a war with Israel because Israel withdrew unilaterally from Lebanon in 2000.
Yeah, no, I think that's true, and in fact, Hezbollah started the attacks on northern Israel after Hamas's attacks, for sure. And it is, and to the extent it is their claim on Israel is zero, whereas in Palestinians can argue there's at least a legitimate claim. Yasmeen?
I think also this idea that these 67,000, 70,000 residents haven't been able to go home for a year now makes it a much more popular war in Israel, because there is sort of a tangible reason in their eyes to eliminate this threat, that as long as there is still this exchange of rocket fire, all these people can't return home safely. It's now been about a year. I think there were hopes that they would be able to return by the time it was time for kids to go back to school. That hasn't materialized. So I think that galvanizes a lot of popular support within Israel. I think among the White House and in the administration, they are quite livid about the way things have escalated in Lebanon, because Amos Hochstein in the National Security Council has served as the liaison for these negotiations between Israel and Lebanon for about a year now. I mean, pretty much since October. And like you said at the start of the show, the whole goal was to avoid this type of escalation, that to contain the war to Gaza, and for it to not spiral into a broader regional war. And at every turn here, Israel, I think, has ignored what the United States has asked them to do, including with the walkie-talkie and the pager explosions. I think the United States was impressed by the technical and intelligence sophistication of that attack. They did. I talked to some people in the White House who said, it was an impressive feat on its own. They don't know what the broader goal is. If it's supposed to accompany a ground invasion, if it's supposed to be a prelude to something else. They just didn't understand what the strategy was around that attack. And then, of course, with the airstrikes over the last week or two, and the way that this war is escalating, I think there is a real fear of what the U.S. could get pulled into. Their goal right now is to basically not get pulled in any further, and they've said, we'll continue supplying Israel militarily, but we're not going to do any more than that. We're determined not to get pulled into this war. I think that's easier said than done. If at some point Iran is feels it's forced to jump in.
Yeah, I think that's the danger here, but it also shows the growing disparity in interest between the United States and Israel. And I think one of the interesting things, and historians will have to write this at some point, is how the administration misjudged that. Frankly, really from the beginning, when you when you think about it, it just didn't absorb the blow the psychological blow that Hamas's attack meant for Israel, and the way that Israel then redefined its security in terms that were much more favorable to a Netanyahu view of the world than say the kinds of leaders that the U.S. would like to hang out with, who are more sympathetic to believing in the coexistence framework, and I think that's. For those, a first draft of history, by the way, Franklin Furr in the Atlantic has an interesting piece on the sort of the first year, really focused mostly on Gaza and Hezbollah. Although it really is a very, very first draft of history. I think much more will be said about this, and we will talk about it for sure. But let's turn to another difficult issue, Yaroslav, Ukraine. We have seen President Zelensky on a political offensive to try to regain the narrative inside the war. As he came here with a view to present a victory plan to all the American political leaders, that includes the two candidates running for president. What do we know about that victory plan, and what do you hear that Zelensky got from Biden?
Well, I mean, we know what he got from Biden. I mean, the president has announced that all the remaining military assistance will be released. We're talking about I think more than $8 billion. Most of it in existing weapons will be released before the end of the term, which is good news for Ukraine. But I think we're now approaching the 2.5 years into the war, nearly 3 years into the war, and I think one thing is clear now: the U.S. since the very beginning sought to contain the war in Ukraine, and opposed attacks in Russia, but also wanted to keep the Russians from attacking outside of Ukraine in NATO countries. But it's now clear that in the war of attrition that we see now in Donbass, especially, long-term Ukraine would be very hard-pressed to win, just because of the disadvantage in numbers. Russia has 3.5 times the population, and it has more ammunition, more weapons, and it's just slowly, inexorably advancing in the east. One town every few weeks. And the war has to be asymmetrical if you listen to people in Ukraine, and that's why Zelensky went for this offensive in the Kursk region of Russia, to show that the Russian army is vulnerable and that the final outcome of the conflict may not be necessarily the way Putin imagines it. And especially that's why Ukraine is paying so much attention to long-range strikes. The U.S. is not allowed Ukraine to use American weapons for the strikes, but Ukraine has developed its own long-range drones, some of which are basically cruise missiles. The Palyanytsia reactive drone, it is a missile. And they've been able to use them to strike targets well above the range of ATACMS and Storm Shadows that the U.S. is still reluctant to allow them to use. We've seen the destruction of giant ammunition warehouses in Russia, with tens of thousands of tons of weapons in the last couple of weeks, attacks on reserve fuel facilities. And Ukraine can do already much more. It's not doing it because of political considerations. Now, for example, Ukraine has not had a civilian air flight in 2.5 years. Russian airports are still functioning. It wouldn't take much for Ukraine to shut down civil aviation in Russia, for example, if it wanted to. Ukraine has not attacked Moscow for more than 2 years. and now it has the capability, it's still showing restraint. And so that is part of the plan B for the Ukrainians. I think if they do not receive the permission, and I think the calculation increasingly is that the war can only end if the cost to Russia and Russia's economy becomes intolerable. The U.S. so far opposed Ukraine targeting the Russian energy infrastructure. The U.S. doesn't want to hurt Russian oil exports. And the difference between Russia and Ukraine is that nobody pays for Russia's war. Ukraine is funded by its allies. And so, in a way, Russia is more vulnerable to this sort of attacks on its economy and infrastructure.
I think that's the argument. So, I mean, Yaroslav, I think you laid out the argument extremely well that Zelensky is presenting to all the political leaders in the United States. And Yasmeen, you were reporting from the White House and watching what was happening in New York before we got on the air. How receptive is the argument?
I don't think Biden is receptive to the argument. I think there's quite a deep division within the administration over whether you allow Ukraine to do this. We know that the State Department especially is supportive of giving them this capability, of giving them permission to use these long-range missiles to strike inside Russia. But Biden is adamantly opposed. And Ivo, we've spoken about this. I've spoken about this with others, that Biden very much has this Cold War era view of Putin, of Russia. His biggest fear has always been a direct confrontation with Russia, but with the U.S. providing support. I think critics of the way the U.S. has provided support to Ukraine would say the U.S. is basically giving them enough to sustain the war, but not to actually win it. And I think that argument plays into this broader debate on using ATACMS inside Russia. We saw it at the United Nations this week where a number of European leaders said they supported giving Ukraine this capability, including Britain's Prime Minister Keir Starmer. So Biden has been facing pressure from within his own administration, from some members of Capitol Hill. And one of the bigger surprises yesterday, because I was also reporting out the partisan divide that had sort of erupted from Zelensky's visit this week. Lindsey Graham said he supported allowing Ukraine to strike inside Russia and to let them win. So a lot of the sort of arguments don't fall neatly along the lines you would expect. And I think, President Biden is mostly alone in the administration in terms of not really wanting to entertain this, but he is ultimately the president and it's his decision to make. We know that Tony Blinken, I think even Jake Sullivan at various points have tried to convince him, maybe not as much as Zelensky is asking now, but to at least allow Ukraine to use this capability to strike inside Russia, dating back almost 2 years. And Biden just really has not been receptive to that argument. And then I think also further complicating it is the threat that Putin made on Wednesday, where he said he would view a nuclear-armed nation helping a non-nuclear nation, meaning Ukraine, strike Russia. He would view that as a joint attack.
Ken, I'm really interested in how I think Yasmeen really lays out very well sort of the debate in the United States, but this has huge implications for allies. Because if, in fact, your willingness to support allies is limited by your fear that there is escalation, how is Japan, which is a non-nuclear country, for example, or Korea, for that matter, or other allies, looking at this and saying, "Well, wait a minute, why do we think it's going to be different if we were attacked by China or by Russia, and the U.S. would have the same fear that you would get to a nuclear war?" Is there a worry in people you talk to in Japan and other places about this kind of issue?
Yeah, you have to get your phone, Ivo. Right. And I think there is a difference because Ukraine is not a treaty ally. So I think the Japanese, the Koreans, the Australians are looking at it a little differently. From an Asian perspective, we are looking at it slightly different. We're watching, people talk about China's support for Russia's defense industrial base. I think what we're watching is more, so what is Russia giving China in return? And I think last week in Europe, Kurt Campbell talked a little bit about this. saying that the US is worried that Russia is giving China technology related to submarine operations. So I think the Asian countries are very much looking at that. China's submarines, they're growing their fleet, but they're still noisy. I remember talking to Japanese defense officials 10 years ago. They were saying, if a Japanese submarine and a Chinese submarine passed by at the bottom of the sea, the Japanese could tell not only that it was a Chinese submarine, but which make it was and which year it was built. And the Chinese side would not even notice that the Japanese had passed. That was the difference in the sonar technology. But if the Chinese acquire technology from Russia to make their submarines quieter, that would be a game changer. And I think in the war in the Taiwan Straits, the submarines will play a crucial factor. So I think, so to answer your question, no, Japan is not that worried because Ukraine is not a treaty ally. But two, we are watching the tech transfer, not from China to Russia, but from Russia to China.
Yeah, and I think just to add to that, and Yaroslav, I think we focus on the nuclear escalation in World War III because that's what Biden has talked about. But when you talk to administration officials, they're also worried about how the Russians can help the Iranians. Tony Blinken said that they're helping them on the nuclear side, and they're worried about providing longer range missiles to the Houthis. To strike American targets, and sort of, two can play this escalation game. And in some ways, I think the intelligence community, according to the New York Times, has concluded that Russia would respond not by nuclear escalation, but by further hybrid attacks in Europe and indeed in the United States that we have already seen, and that should play a significant role in the decision-making process. How do you see it?
Well, if we talk about nuclear escalation, remember what President Putin said on day one of the war. If anybody dares to help Ukraine and interfere in my special military operation, you will see the response of which you have never seen in your lifetimes. And yet nothing happened. He just now announced this new nuclear doctrine at a time when, American and German-made tanks are driving on sovereign Russian soil in Kursk. And have been there for 2 months now. So I think the fear of nuclear escalation has receded dramatically because at every turn, Russian red lines turn out to be, just in the minds of Western policymakers. And so many things that have been done until now that were unthinkable before, turn out to be okay. What Putin can do is horizontal escalation. And he has been speaking about this. And as you rightly said, probably the biggest fear is with the Houthis, because there have been contacts with the Houthis about potentially transferring sophisticated anti-ship missiles that could pose a real danger to the American Navy in the Red Sea. And we have to think about what would be the implications of a U.S. destroyer, even an aircraft carrier being sunk or seriously damaged by a Russian missile. And obviously, the retaliation will not be against the Houthis in that case. So these are all factors there. However, if you look at the reality in the battlefield, Ukraine has been doing lots of things to Russia that were unimaginable even a month ago. And yet Putin keeps just steadying the blows.
Yeah, no, I think that's certainly the case. It's a complicated set of issues that we will continue to watch. We'll see what comes out of the Trump-Zelensky meeting, which is taking place as we speak. For sure,
I think we should just note how that meeting started.
Yeah, absolutely.
That I think it's going on right now, or maybe it's close to ending. But they stood in front of the cameras, and Trump said with Zelensky standing next to him, that he had a great relationship with Putin. Zelensky, I think, trying to be diplomatic, said, "Well, I hope we can have a great relationship." And then Trump went on to call the 2019 impeachment, which of course was linked to a call with Zelensky, a hoax. So I will be very interested to see what Trump says coming out of that meeting.
Well, hopefully, the actor in President Zelensky's background will hope can keep a straight face as this continues. But all of that we will watch with closely, and we'll discuss it next time when we get back on World Review. But now let's talk about Japan. Ken, you stayed up overnight to watch what was going on. Bring us up to date. I don't think everyone is following the leadership election in the LDP, but the consequences, of course, for Japan and indeed for the Indo-Pacific and the world are significant. The third largest economy getting a new leader.
Well, so first of all, why this was important. Kishida, the current prime minister, had established a great relationship with Biden and strengthened the US-Japan alliance, and also expanded that alliance to a trilateral partnership with South Korea. So this is really the foundation of Biden's Indo-Pacific strategy. And that could have changed, and that was at stake. And why that is important is because the next Japanese leader could very well be the prime minister in 2027, 3 years from now, when all experts in Washington talk of the Taiwan crisis. And Xi Jinping himself has ordered his military to be ready, not necessarily to conduct the Taiwan war exactly on 2027, but to be at least ready for war. And last week, the Chief of Naval Operations, Lisa Franchetti, in her annual navigation plan for the first time said that the American Navy also has to be ready by 2027 for a potential war with the People's Republic of China. So that's why this leadership race was important. And there were three main candidates. First, initially, the favorite was Shinjiro Koizumi, who was the 43-year-old son of former very popular Prime Minister Junichiro Koizumi. And he was expected to win by a landslide. But during the many TV debates, he showed that he really doesn't have much experience. For instance, there was an exchange with the Kamikawa Yoko, the current foreign minister. She asked Koizumi, there's a G7 in Canada coming up. What's your message to the world at the G7? And Koizumi's answers was, well, the Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau was 43 years old when he became Prime Minister. I'm 43 years old. We have something in common, so maybe we have a good rapport. And the fellow panelists and the entire nation was like, what? So he lost steam, and it came down to two candidates. One was Sanae Takaichi, who's a very conservative woman, but very close protege to Shinzo Abe. And the other one was Shigeru Ishiba, who was a longtime rival of Shinzo Abe. And it turned out to be Ishiba Shigeru. I thought it was going to be Takaichi Sanae, the conservative, but it was not. So who is Ishiba Shigeru? He is 67 years old. So when he becomes prime minister on Tuesday, he'll be the second oldest leader in the G7 after the 81-year-old Biden. So he's a veteran. How long has he been a politician? 38 years. That's actually longer than the 36 years that Biden was a senator. And this was the fifth time he attempted for the leadership race, and he finally got it. So so what is his leadership going to be like? We have to understand that for Japan, the number one foreign policy strategy, although people don't like to say it, is to make sure that the US troops are based in Japan. There are 55,000 American troops in Japan, the largest contingent anywhere on earth. And the foreign ministry, the unspoken rule of the Japanese foreign ministry is let's make sure that they're here, because if the American troops, 55,000 of them are here, China is not going to invade Japan. So that's the starting point. Ishiba had some troubling proposals in that sense in the leadership campaign. He talked about reviewing the status of forces agreement, which is the rules under which the Americans are based in Japan. For instance, if they commit any crimes, the Japanese judiciary cannot try them, for instance. And they have the bases which they operate on are basically run by the Americans. So Ishiba was calling for a more equal relationship, and that Japan co-owns the bases. And he was also talking about creating an Asian NATO because deterrence in Ukraine failed. He was saying that we need something like NATO in Asia, but that's pretty not very pragmatic. So there were troubling policies. But I talked to Rahm Emanuel last night, and he told me anything that Ishiba Shigeru said in the election campaign, he will forget soon. So we'll see if how much he will be bound by the campaign rhetoric.
Well, it's nice to know that the U.S. ambassador to Japan is already undermining the prime minister's public statement. So, was that on the record? I imagine it was on the record. It is now, by the way. So that's good to know. Ken, thanks for really explaining what was going on and the impact on the regional politics. Yaroslav, to what extent do you think in the United States military in particular, was there a close focus on this issue because of the Taiwan contingent, which you've written about in the past?
Yeah, well, obviously, I mean, the U.S. military knows that it has to be prepared for a conflict with China, and I think there is a realization after the war in Ukraine and the war in Gaza in the Middle East that U.S. resources are stretched. And the U.S. is already hard-pressed to supply Ukrainians and the Israelis with some types of ammunition, etc. And it will take time for the military-industrial base to catch up with the requirements of a possible conflict with China that obviously everybody wants to avert. But they may not be may not be possible to avert. And obviously the big question here is Taiwan and whether Taiwan is ready to defend itself. And having been to Taiwan and talked to lots of young people there, you are struck by the difference in the attitude. And the army is not popular in Taiwan. The young people don't want to serve, and it's quite possible the way things are going that one day China will be able to just coerce and absorb Taiwan without having to go to war. Which would also have giant implications for America standing in the region, promptly that Japan and South Korea to hedge more, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, no, I think that's the era we're moving into in one form or another. Yasmeen, of course, President Biden had a very good relationship with Prime Minister Kishida, who was in Delaware just earlier, I guess last week, as part of the Quad leaders meeting. It was Prime Minister Kishida's last meeting. Any word from Washington and the White House what they were hoping for and looking for in this election and the leadership race?
I haven't, just because I've been consumed with the Middle East and then Ukraine this week. I haven't paid as close attention. I will say I found it very amusing to watch all these leaders fly from Asia to Wilmington, which I have spent a lot of time in, and go to President Biden's old school and have dinner there and sort of see the Wilmington that he talks about a lot, and that we've spent a lot of time in. I do think one of the things that this administration takes a lot of pride in and touts a lot and feels that they don't get enough attention for is the work that they've done with Japan and with South Korea and building that trilateral relationship to counter China. And so I think the most important thing to them is to have a leader that will continue those efforts with them, I think there's every expectation that if Vice President Harris wins the election, she would build on that and continue the same, because she actually did a lot of the administration's diplomacy throughout Asia and especially Southeast Asia. I think President Biden took more of the lead with Japan and South Korea, but they have focused quite a bit on Asian allies, on the Indo-Pacific, in terms of building this bulwark to China. And so I think for them, the most important thing, both everyone's talked about, this potential invasion of Taiwan and what that would mean for the U.S. militarily. I think the projection is that China could try to take Taiwan by 2027, right? So that would fall inside of Vice President Harris or Donald Trump presidency. Obviously, those would be dealt with very differently depending on who wins. But I think for this administration, the most important thing is to have a Japanese leader who will sort of continue building on these efforts with them and continue the work in trying to counter China. Not just militarily, but economically and the competition that they're trying to manage.
So, Ken, let me turn the question around to you. Now that we know that Prime Minister Kishida is there, that the relationship, at least with South Korea, is unlikely to be in a crisis because of an alternative leadership struggle. How do you think the Japanese government is looking at the dual challenge of working with a Harris administration versus a Trump administration.
Right. So the alternative path that you mentioned would have been a Prime Minister Takaichi. She would have gone to the Yasukuni Shrine. She'd vowed to go to the Yasukuni Shrine every single year. And that would have really disrupted the trilateral cooperation with South Korea and the US. The current Prime Minister Yoon Suk-yeol will probably have managed to absorb it, but his successor could have been a very anti-Japanese candidate because of these visits. And what's interesting is that the next South Korean presidential election is 2027, the year of the Taiwan crisis. So I think the Americans were very much worried about that scenario. But Ishiba will not go to the Yasukuni Shrine at least every year, and at least not in an official capacity. And what's interesting is that one of the reasons why Ishiba won in the end was that he got the support of Prime Minister Kishida and his faction at the very end. So Kishida would maintain influence in the Ishiba government, and I think Ishiba will honor Kishida's number one legacy, which is his foreign policy and strengthening of the alliance. Now, regarding Harris and Ishiba, or Trump and Ishiba, so I think what the Japanese side is thinking is that if Harris wins, she will go to APEC and G20 with Biden. And on that occasion, I think the Japanese side would want to meet with Harris in APEC and then meet Xi Jinping there as well. And it's very important for the Japanese side to meet with Harris before she meets Xi Jinping in Brazil at the G20. If that order is the other way around and Harris sees Xi Jinping before Japan, that would be very problematic. The relationship with Ishiba and Trump is the wild card here because Trump will try to raise the money that Japan pays to host the Japanese troops, like the same situation with South Korea. Ishiba has said in the campaign that I will explain to Mr. Trump or whoever the American president is with facts and figures and data how important the Japanese bases are. And I don't think facts and figures and charts will influence Trump whatsoever. So that will be a disaster in the making, but I look forward to that.
Well, it will be interesting to watch all of this, and we'll have to wait what the U.S. election is. At least we know who's the Prime Minister of Japan is going to be for the next few years. Fascinating set of discussions, lots of things happening. I want to thank Yasmeen Abutaleb, Ken Moriyasu, and Yaroslav Trofimov for an excellent conversation. Thank you so much. I want to thank all of you for tuning in. We'll be back next week with another edition of World Review. Until then, have a wonderful weekend.